I'm going to be talking about the role of elders in our traditions. So let me start by saying that if you ask an elder in our traditions what authority they have in the craft, they will tell you none. That nobody should actually blindly be accepted as an authority, and actually, elders will teach people to ask and to think and to probe and to ferret out things for themselves, to use their own minds. And even though our elders can be asked for their advice and opinions on certain topics, and they will definitely provide answers to those questions, ultimately, though, the individual or the specific covens can choose to accept the advice or the considered opinions of the elders. Now, as usual, I'm only talking about my own personal perspectives as an initiate in the Xhosa and Sacred Pentagraph traditions. So today I want to step back and set the stage for you because I think it's important to do that, and so we'll do that for a few moments. So from our history and our perspective, we know that covens back when, prior to around the 1970s, and perhaps even before that, didn't really have the concept of a tradition as we know it today. What existed were independent covens, in other words, groups of witches practiced together. There was no centralized, organized religious structure, and there still is no central authority or leadership like a pope or a caliph or any of those other religious type leaders. And you will see why this is relevant to the discussion as the discussion continues. So, we still don't have a central authority or leadership that governs the whole of our traditions, at least. Now, at that time, witches like one of our elders, Sybil Leek, for example, would simply say that she was a member of the old religion and that she practiced witchcraft. Um, and I would like to explain what I mean when I use the term witchcraft for the sake of clarity. Because as I've discussed at length in one of my other videos, there really is no single definition of the word. But when I'm using the term witchcraft, I'm using it the way our past elders in our traditions used the word and or the term, and that is that witchcraft incorporates occultism and spiritual arts and sciences from the ancient wisdom. So that's my sort of definition that I'm using for the word witchcraft. So, in many contexts, in other contexts, people will separate out the practices of witchcraft, and that is as something that is not religious, and that does not require a religious perspective. That, of course, is not the case for me, and probably also other initiates in our traditions. I think that the term, in terms of the old religion, for example, witchcraft was a religion. Um, and sometimes witchcraft and the old religion, as you know, are used interchangeably in our traditions, but that's not universal. So the idea of traditions as they are understood today did not exist back then. The phenomena only came about much later, as I think we've talked about before. Now, the concept of a religion, as just a general concept, has been around for a long time. But I think it is important to really talk about the concept of religion, specifically when it comes to the religion of witchcraft, which is, of course, the religion that we practice in our tradition. First of all, like, what is religion in general terms? So, that's really tricky to define because, of course, it always depends on who's doing the defining. But generally speaking, I would say that for something to be considered a religion, it has to meet a few criteria. So some would define religion as simply the belief in the supernatural or a sacred being or a force, while other scholars will say that religion is a way to deal with ultimate questions of life, like what is the meaning of life and what happens after death. But in general, I will say that the concept of religion in general includes a shared belief system with shared doctrine regarding the divine or ultimate reality. In other words, the word doctrine is really a codification of beliefs, which simply means the process of arranging and writing down that system. Now, doctrine does not only refer to religion. Any system of beliefs can be doctrine, including things like law, politics, foreign policy, even military policy, or any ideology or teaching. Basically, doctrine is a set of like rules or principles that governs a group of people who follow that specific doctrine. But so those people need to accept and adhere to the doctrine. Now, religion also includes a group of people who have shared practices and beliefs, such as the practice of prayer, rituals, and meditations that can connect them to the sacred or the divine. Often, religions also have sacred texts and narratives with stories and myths that will explain their particular worldview to the adherents of the religion. Now, many religions have tenets, axioms, and precepts. So, tenets, for example, are the core principles that are held by the group. Let me give you a few examples. So, one of the tenets of our traditions is the acceptance and the belief of the ideals of a balanced life, for example. In Christianity, you would have the concept that people need to confess their sins in order to receive the sacrament. In Buddhism, people need to refrain from taking a life, refrain from stealing, refrain from sexual misconduct, wrong speech, and also refrain from intoxication. Axioms, however, are basically a starting point for further reasoning and deduction. They are that foundational truth that cannot be logically denied without falling into some sort of contradiction. Axioms are self evident. Now, one of our tradition's axioms is that all of creation is composed of vibrations which proceed from the unknowable, eternal, infinite God or Goddess. In Buddhism, one of the core axioms is the idea of the Four Noble Truths, for example, and that life involves suffering, which is caused by desire, and that the suffering can actually be ended if you are going to follow the Noble Eightfold Path. In Christianity, it is seen that humanity is sinful and it requires salvation that can only be achieved through Christ's atonement, for example. Now, precepts are the practical general rules intended to regulate behavior and thought of individuals. So, some examples of precepts would be know thyself, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's a Christian one, for example. And then in Buddhism, you can say refrain from killing, stealing, and lying. Those are some examples of precepts. So now that we've covered sort of the basic fundamentals of religion in general, I'd like to tie that back to the main topic that I was going to talk about today. And I want to draw your attention to the very basic issue is that each religion is its own specific construct. That these constructs are made up of the things that I just talked about. In other words, religions exist because groups of people share a set of beliefs that are governed by these shared core principles, values, ideologies, and so on. Now, what I have seen many times is that when people decide to take up the religion of witchcraft, is that they are prone to taking the construct of the religion of Christianity, and specifically in the West because that tends to be the dominant religion. And then they would take that construct of Christianity and they would try to superimpose witchcraft onto that construct. That, of course, is not actually possible because those two religious constructs are not compatible. At very basic levels, if we start to look at the different concepts and unpick them, constructs and unpick them, we will see that, for example, Wicca does not proselytize. We don't attempt to convert people to our religion of witchcraft or the old religion. And I actually think it would be a mistake to think that our religion needs to take on those models or to take on even a model of a centralized governing structure. And really, our actual religion of Wicca would abhor that idea in any case. Now, um, if we just took a quick look at some of the axioms of Christianity, for example, where the adherents of the religion believe that humanity is inherently sinful and that it requires salvation achieved through Jesus Christ's atonement, well, that is not compatible with our tradition, for example, because we don't believe that in our religion, that we need an intercessor. We don't need anybody to forgive our sins, and we don't believe that humanity is inherently sinful. We believe that each witch in our religion is a priest or priestess in their own right, that they are sovereign individuals, that each witch is self-governing, that they can manage their own affairs, and that they are free from external control. That they are their own ultimate authority. So even if we look at other religions, for example, like Islam, they believe that witchcraft is strictly forbidden, and it's actually considered one of the most serious sins in that religion. They also believe that the holy books like the Quran are the final preserved word of God. So in other words, their book in their book there is no leeway for evolution or change. Um, Now, also another example is, according to my understanding, religious Jews also view witchcraft and magic as abhorrent, according to their Torah. But I'm not actually a scholar on that particular topic, so I'm not really able to comment on some of those intricacies of the differences between cultural Jewishness and or being a religious Jew. So let's just focus on the main point that I am making, and that is that you cannot superimpose one religion onto another one. You cannot impose one religious construct onto another religious construct, because these are not compatible. And it's not possible in our religions to do that, because we have very different beliefs and doctrines and symbols that are not compatible with the examples that I gave you. Now, back to the main topic after we've covered some of these fundamentals, and that is to say that when we go back to the topic of the elders, what is the function of elders in our specific tradition? So, I would say that where practicable in our tradition, elders first have to have served as members of the high priesthood. They have served their own covens and covens that have hived from their covens, and upon becoming elders, they will give up direct control and rule of that coven that they served, and that they will then forego personal ego and show. What is important to note is that age has absolutely nothing to do with becoming an elder. So you don't automatically become an elder once you reach a certain age. Becoming an elder in our traditions has very specific requirements that need to be met before someone is elevated to that degree of elder. The existing elders will ensure that the person has met the criteria, which includes things like for the person even to be considered coming elder degree, for example, that they will be a force for good, and that they have developed the strength of spirit and understanding of human nature, amongst other requirements, and things that would also include being able to work magics of the craft. They would also have to have excellent knowledge and occult wisdom. Um, they would have to have shown and provided a track record of understanding and knowledge of the craft as a whole and our traditions. Only elders in our tradition can confer the role of elder on a member of the high priesthood who has met all of the criteria. In other words, there is a process of like recognition and certification that cannot be done by, say, a random covener or, and a random person in our tradition can't declare themselves an elder. Further, elders have to really have demonstrated that they are capable and that they have occult wisdom, that they can be trusted to fulfill the requirements of the role. I would say that potential incumbents of that position also need to be trusted to not cause any damage to the traditions. Another really important point that should be noted is that one of the requirements is that the incumbent or prospective incumbent works to the glory of the gods rather than self-aggrandizement, even before they can be considered for eldership. So the role or the job of an elder, for example, is to give sage advice based on ancient wisdom, based on ethical standards and democratic values. Elders are also tasked with ensuring the survival of the craft by upholding and preserving and protecting the religious traditions, its doctrines, and that also includes providing or making sure there's an environment that allows for reasonable arguments, ensuring that the craft doctrine is open to challenges, that it can grow and evolve as needed. Now, upholding and preserving the faith is also part of their job, and that could also mean writing new rituals and preserving already codified writings that could offer wisdom to those who seek it. Now, elders will offer sage advice and opinions on questions that is brought to them. They don't actually pass laws or bills or determine the policies of autonomous covens. If a coven chooses to ask the coven council or a specific elder for advice, they're free to accept or reject that. The coven of elders the council of elders, for example, is not a centralized authority, and elders do not feel that their or anyone else's opinions are sacrosanct. So nothing is immune to criticism or debate or change. Now, elders, of course, can be asked to offer advice and insight, either as a council of elders, as a tribunal, or as individuals. And specifically, they will answer questions that concern matters that they feel are important to the craft in general. And sometimes, of course, elders will also be asked questions that are related to particular coven issues. If, of course, we are talking about the Council of Elders, the covens that participate in those proceedings do that by choice, and they will ask questions that they would like advice on. The scribe will then write up the consensus of opinions that are expressed by the collective elders, and then it will be presented for a vote or approval by those that are asking the questions. Now, in our traditions, the elders accept that questions and debate are sometimes necessary, that no one person's opinion should be accepted without question. And as initiates of the traditions, we learn to talk to each other through discussions, and we learn from each other. Elders also value moral ethics, democratic principles, and those help the craft to evolve. Now, our traditional elders do not make themselves out to be authorities, and they don't have the ultimate word on anything, and they certainly don't issue decrees on anything. I also think that that's probably why traditionally in a council of elders meeting, they would remain hooded and unseen so that they can speak their minds without the personality involvements. Because they aren't grand poobahs or masters or witch queens or witch kings of anyone. Because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the very basic requirements is that for somebody to hold their position, they aren't after self-aggrandizement. And that goes back to the comment that I made about sovereignty of individual members of the traditions as well, and also the sovereignty of the covens within the tradition. because each wish is considered to be an authority unto themselves. No single person has authority over another person. So, for the sake of clarity, let me quickly reiterate what I have said, perhaps in one of the other videos regarding a coven council. So each coven has a member of the high priesthood or members of the high priesthood who have specific duties, and those duties include things like leading the coven, spiritual counseling, initiation, and guiding the direction of the coven. However, each coven or is comprised of a coven council, which are all the coveners in that coven with the high priesthood, and each member has one vote. So that's what we consider the coven council. Each coven is autonomous. It is run autonomously, and they have to take responsibility for their own behavior and their own practices outside and inside of the coven. The elders have no say in the individual coven council matters, for example. That's really up to the coven council. Elders also do not have any social or political power. Covens and covendoms are by their nature fractured and independent. Elders will not openly side with the high priesthood if it opposes the will of individual covens, for example. The coven itself will have to work out their own problems and implement any advice given by the elders if the coven council sees fit to do that. Now, as mentioned previously, elders value democratic government and freedom of choice and freedom of conscience. These are the ideals that elders will espouse. I will say, though, that in my experience and what I've seen is that the wisdom of the elders is very much respected, and that their advice isn't actually taken lightly because they have really devoted their entire lives to the work of the craft. Another thing that should really be mentioned is that in our traditions, you cannot receive your last initiation in either the Horsa or Sacred Pentagraph traditions until you die, because both birth and life are considered initiations, and there is another initiation that occurs after you die, which is another reason I think that the elders that are living don't see themselves as grand poobahs, because they haven't reached the last level of elevation in the traditions. Also, they're not after self-aggrandizement or whatever. They haven't reached the highest level, and they won't receive that honor until they have passed on. I hope that this video has explained some of the ways that the elders function within our tradition, and that when we think about religion and self-governance, it's very important to realize that one of our fundamental constructs in the religion is that witches are sovereign beings, and that even elders don't have any authority over them. I hope to see you next time, and I hope you've enjoyed this chat. Blessings.